Hello colleagues, and welcome to this channel. Since the start of the pandemic, have you been teaching using Zoom exclusively? Where I am and where I was in March, April, May 2020, and into June and so forth, we pretty much were using Zoom exclusively. We were thrown into a new teaching situation and students were put into a new learning situation, and there really wasn't all that much time for reflection. Yet as these temporary measures in my part of the world and perhaps in your part of the world started to become semi-permanent, perhaps we needed more time for reflection. Not necessarily reflection about how we could use Zoom better, but a much larger kind of reflection about other matters that could improve our teaching and perhaps improve our students' learning. We haven't had so much time to think about pedagogics, technology, and alternatives in the midst of what we were doing. Now that there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or we may think that there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, what comes next? In all likelihood, many of us are not going to go back to exclusively 100% on-campus teaching in person with students. But exactly what's going to happen, the future is a bit unclear. Is there a growing need of a hybrid where on-campus teaching in person and learning on the part of students is mixed with digital and distance teaching and learning? And what would that look and what would that sound like? Maybe we need alternatives to live teaching on Zoom as part of a wider strategy for hybrid higher education. Do you need to start to prepare for this hybrid situation? If you're not entirely satisfied with the answers to some of these questions, perhaps this channel is for you. Let me put it another way. Let's pretend that there's a time machine, and it will be back in January 2020. The name of a city in China, Wuhan, from being very obscure for many of us to becoming front page news, and how SARS-CoV-2 was beginning to accelerate in its spread to other places around the world. And then, weeks to months later, everything was different. What would I have liked to know at that time, just before I and others became overwhelmed by new demands on us and new ways to teach and new ways for our students to learn? That is the idea about what some of the content in this channel will be. I was teaching during January to June 2020, but for several reasons I had a relatively light teaching load during the rest of the year. This, combined with other things, gave me a lot more time than perhaps some of my colleagues have had to reflect, to experiment, to try out certain new things, or combinations of things that I had done before. Of course, perhaps for you, or perhaps for some of your colleagues, some of the things on this channel will not be new. You will be familiar with them. I would like to share some strategies and tools, and also some very specific details with you and anyone who's on this channel. I hope that some of this will be helpful. So, what were we doing prior to the pandemic? Many of us were teaching a lot, some of us were teaching less. Some of us were involved in administrative tasks alongside our teaching, and we might have been participating in outreach activities. But let's remember what it was like. And of course, one of the first things that one would do as an instructor was that you were going to prepare the education. Prepare the course, prepare the module, or prepare the lecture. Now, there could be a lot more that I could talk about with regard to course preparation, but for the moment, let's try to pretend way things actually were before the pandemic. And for that, we need to go to a real classroom. And we can pretend in the past that the classroom would have been populated with students, and at this moment, as the beginning of a lecture is going to be taking place in a few minutes, that there will be maybe 24 students in the room, and they'll be chatting a bit, and there'll be others arriving, and you'll be looking at your watch and wondering when they're going to get quiet, and then you're going to start to begin to hold your lecture. But while your teaching style may vary, and your subject may lend itself to certain kinds of teaching styles or pedagogical tools, let's assume for the moment that these kinds of things might be happening in a classroom. One, you might be holding a lecture, a one-way kind of lecture that was mostly delivery. It was a complement to the literature that the students were reading. To do that, you might be using a whiteboard, and you will be drawing on the whiteboard. You will be putting points. You might have a table, a diagram, and so forth. And of course, what you've been writing on the whiteboard would still be there, and so you could go back and point to what you were just talking about, or something you were talking about 5 minutes before. Not just on a small screen where it was just what was there visible, say on Zoom, is what you talk about, and you don't go back to it again. Or perhaps it was more of a dialogue. Of course, there were parts of the lecture where you were speaking directly to the students and you were maybe not hoping on being interrupted. And then there were other parts of the lecture where you were encouraging a dialogue, you were posing questions, you were hoping the students were answering them, and perhaps you were breaking them up to groups, and in these groups they were dealing with particular topics that you had decided. They discussed these, perhaps they left the classroom for a number of minutes and then they returned, and you could have a discussion and you could write on the board what the conclusions were, and then you could discuss that and so forth. And of course we can do some of these things digitally as well with the software and the tools that we have available to us. We could also combine all of this depending upon the subject matter, what pedagogical tools you felt comfortable with, and your philosophy of teaching and your ideas about students' learning. What can we see in all of this would be a commonality. You can, of course, pause this video and reflect on it at any time that you would like. And in fact, as a professional educator, you should be during these lectures, if we could call them, or at least these videos on YouTube, you should think to yourself, maybe I should pause and think about this. Well, we're waiting for the projector. We should also consider the fact that most of us, when we look at YouTube videos, we are thinking that we are going to be entertained. However, these videos on these channels, they're not supposed to be entertaining you. So the question is, are you going to behave like a student and take notes, or are you going to be in let's be entertained mode? Well, when it comes to commonalities, I would like to suggest that most of us, most of the time, were standing when we were teaching, just as I am doing now. We would walk around, we would speak with the students, we would write things on the whiteboard, we would have a PowerPoint slides. There could be interaction directly in the room. But we were in a desperate situation in March, April, May, whatever months it is for you in 2020. And when we were thrown into this situation of doing things quite differently, it wasn't exactly a time to reflect on what we were doing in relation to what we were doing before. We went from animated, walking, and talking to sitting. Good morning. This lecture in the urban ecology course concerns sewage, wastewater, and infrastructure. In this lecture, I will be talking about the various processes where raw sewage or other kinds of effluent from a city is treated. In some ways, this mimics natural processes such as nitrification and denitrification. we became talking heads. No animation. It's as if we'd lost the ability to walk and talk at the same time. We could not communicate with our body language in any way at all. And this probably was a problem for many of us, and probably for the students. Now, there has been an idea in teaching and learning about VAK, visualizing modality, auditory modality, and kinesthetic modality, that there were 3 modes or styles of learning. This model was criticized for a number of reasons. There was a lack of imperial basis. For us to be able to use this model when we are trying to teach and we are trying to have students learn certain things, the idea was that we needed to assess each individual student in our class to determine what was their preferred mode of learning. And then we could teach some students with a more visual, others more audio, others more kinesthetic. That was at least some sort of an idea. You could tailor your pedagogical methods according to this. Now, of course, there was also a criticism in that maybe we shouldn't be making it easier for students to learn. Maybe part of learning is the challenge to learn about learning. But perhaps that is a more sort of higher level of a taxonomy of learning at a university level. Instead, perhaps it would be an idea that we would take the terms used in this model and not think about that it was learning, but think about teaching. Let's instead take our teaching and say that we need to have visual, auditory, and kinesthetic components in our teaching. So again, what we did was we had in the past, we walked around, we talked, we had all kinds of techniques at our disposal. And instead, what happened then? We ended up going to teaching via Zoom. We had sub-quality video, even if we changed one webcam for another, usually. We had sub-quality audio. We became talking heads again, sitting in front of our laptops, with extremely little motion at our disposal, because our students were only seeing this much of us, unless, of course, we did something different, if we maybe didn't teach solely using Zoom all the time. So just as this model with having visual, auditory, and movement kinesthetics, we can think of a chair with 3 legs, or for that matter, perhaps a tripod with 3 legs. If you remove one, things aren't going to work very well. And I would suggest that this is one of the reasons why we cannot engage as much with our students as we'd like, and our students don't find us always as engaging as we would like them to find us. When it comes to sitting and teaching, most of us, most of the time, are seldom very good at it. Of course, there can be situations where part of a session with students, we may be seated. It could be that students will be coming up to us and discussing things and then going back and so forth. But if we think about other kinds of situations where we are communicating with the entire group at the same time, it might make sense to not be seated. If we sit hour and hour and hour on end, what will be happening then, of course? It's not good for us. It's not good for our work environment. It's not good for our health. It's probably not good for our students, and it may not be one of the best ways of teaching. Moving around, as I'm doing now in this pre-recorded lecture, seems to be something which is incredibly underrated when we have moved to one kind of very unusual kind of teaching using sub-quality audio, sub-quality visuals, and very little moving around. And there we are, sitting in our chairs. Besides this, what might other reasons be that students are less engaged? Of course, the pandemic itself, they are worried about certain things. or there have been changes in society, or they work part-time and study part-time and they don't have their part-time job anymore. There could be a number of things in place. We have a certain distance between the instructor and the student, just like you right now, you and I have a certain distance. We may find it difficult to be engaging, and the students may find it difficult to be engaging. We could also be worried about particular things. Our repertoire of what we know about teaching and learning has become compromised. Of course, we can translate some of those things to this sort of pandemic situation, but it doesn't always translate so easily, some of the things that we might want to be doing. We have succumbed to what I'm trying to call is a keyhole effect. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the students are interacting with us as if they're looking through a keyhole. We have the digital technology. They may be looking at Zoom on a cell phone, a mobile, a smartphone. And when they do see us holding a lecture in Zoom, it looks like this. Now, one of the purposes of these series of videos, or dare I say lectures, on this YouTube channel is, in a sense, is a pushback towards Zoom in the sort of hegemonic kind of status that it has. Of course, I will readily admit that Zoom has a place and has been extremely important, and it would have been very difficult to carry on most of the kinds of teaching that was conducted during, shall we say, March, April, May of 2020. But at some point maybe we could start doing things slightly differently and have complements to just Zoom itself. Some of us have invested a lot of time and effort into perfecting our abilities in Zoom. And perhaps some of the things which I bring up in these lectures in this channel are not of interest for you. Perhaps it would make more sense for you to hone your skills in Zoom and become better and better at that. And then you will be able to become more engaging in some fashion within the confines that Zoom presents us with. Now, depending on how old you are, I'm 56, you may have spent formative years watching television news, evening television news, perhaps or perhaps not. And during the 1970s, and the 1980s and the 1990s, of course it depends upon which country, television news tended to have a particular kind of format. The program started with perhaps some dramatic music, with one or two anchors sitting. Notice they were sitting and speaking to the camera. They probably had a teleprompter instead of just this sort of paper that I have some notes on here. Let's look at some of the television news from the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, where I live. You don't necessarily have to understand what they're saying to get the point which I'm trying to make.
Med beskedet att barn i förskolan och grundskolan ska stanna hemma om någon som de bor med är konstaterad covid-19-smittad, även om öka. Idag rapporterades 17 629 nya bekräftade fall av covid-19, och här ser vi utvecklingen av bekräftade fall i Sverige sedan i mars. Och 117 dödsfall har rapporterats sedan i fredags, och därmed har...
By and large, we watched people sitting down telling us the news. It was one-way communication. Was that the only format? No. What about meteorologists? What did they do when they were communicating with us? Were they seated? No, of course not. They weren't seated. They were standing up. And what were they doing?
fortsätter det vara ordentligt kallt även under natten, men sen blir det förändringar för att vi har lågtryck som kommer att ställa till det lite grann med ny midluft som kommer upp, och det gör det att det kommer att mula på allt eftersom. För Europas del så har vi ett lågtryck som ligger här över Italien under morgondagen. Det är på väg bort emot Balkanområdet. Samtidigt så har vi ett lågtrycksområde här från Island ner mot Storbritannien. Det här kommer att gräva ner kallluften som tar sig efterhand här.
They were standing in front of maps. They were moving their hands and gesturing. The way the warm front or the cold front was moving, they were also showing that and describing things. They were sometimes looking a bit like this, and they were other times looking right at you. They were, in a sense, interacting with something like that. There might also be a graph showing temperatures or snowfall, and later there might be a radar, something along those lines. But by and large, during the television news, meteorologists did something completely different than everyone else did in the evening news. They stood, they gestured, they walked around, they talked, they half looked at the map, they half looked at the camera, they half looked at you. There was a dynamism and an engagement which is hard to give people unless you're standing and moving around. From television and back to YouTube, where we are right now. Since sometime during the initial months of the pandemic, I have watched countless hours of YouTube videos about photography, videography, composition, gear, and so forth. I would say that I am a pretty good amateur photographer, and I would say I still have a lot to learn about videography. In other words, making films with audio. Based on what I have learned by watching others, and based on some of the things which I have done with my students, even if I didn't teach as much during the latter half of 2020 as I normally do, some of the things I have done, I believe that I can, in certain circumstances, be much more engaging with my students, and I can widen the keyhole. Not perfect, not the same thing as being in the classroom, but I can do something which is a hybrid between a laptop mode and being back in the classroom with the students. You can do those things with some of the technologies which have been added on to Zoom and so forth. Yes, you can do that, and that is a part of a hybrid. But I would like to sort of widen our own repertoire of things that we could do, make things easier. So the hybrid here in hybrid higher education is the idea of reanimating teaching in the digital and Zoom era. And after some time in sitting in front of our laptops, we need to sort of break free from the confines that we have placed upon ourselves and do things somewhat differently, as per some of the suggestions that you may be seeing in part of this video series here. If you liked this video, and this promise of certain things which I have mentioned here, you might consider liking it below. That means it gets sort of slightly higher in the search algorithms on YouTube. More people can find it. Not only liking it, and particularly as you might be interested in seeing more videos or lectures in this channel, you might also consider subscribing below. In this way, you might be able to keep up with the channel. Finally, there is the bell which comes from the subscribing. And if you click the bell and click also on all, or whatever it says there, then that means that each time a new video in this channel is uploaded, you will be notified in some way that it is there.